In effect, the United States created ISIS. Nothing like it existed before the American occupation. We created it, it's ours, and now we're trying to deal with the consequences. Okay, you ready? The war in Iraq, in the streets of Baghdad, no less than in the halls of Congress or in the stump speeches of the campaign trail, is in its essence political, not military. Like the terrorists who hijacked American airliners and flew them into American buildings, the fighters daily ambushing American troops are attacking not American military power, but American will. And thanks to the way President Bush and his colleagues chose to build the case for war, and the errors they've made in prosecuting it, American will is an increasingly vulnerable target. In the end, defeat or victory in Iraq will be judged not by who controls Baghdad, but by whether the war has left Americans more secure than they were before it was undertaken. I wrote this piece in July 2003. The insurgency very slowly, very particularly, very specifically, looking at the various slender lines that supported the occupation and cutting precisely each line. The UN, snip. The UN fled the country. The Jordanians who might lend troops to the effort, snip. The Jordanian embassy is attacked. And even as the American leaders in the United States are telling the American people that there's no insurgency at all, by the late summer, it's absolutely clear that not only is there an insurgency, but it is well-led, well-planned, and absolutely ruthless. The point of this piece was to try to identify this insurgency as the root enemy in the new war. The first weeks of the occupation, in which security in Baghdad collapsed, chaos ruled the streets, and the fledgling occupation authority daily issued conflicting statements and made promises it did not keep, were a fiasco. They proved an enormous boon to violent opponents, providing them in the lawless streets of post-war Iraq the political equivalent of a warm petri dish in which to grow. It had been based on the threat of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to have existed. It was based also on a promise given by the political leadership of the Bush administration to the American people that the war would be, as one Bush ally put it, a cakewalk. Both of those promises were proved in the first months of the war to be egregiously, tragically, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the Americans were caught in a kind of existential, lonely world of the present. Where are we? Why are we fighting? Why did we come here? When will we leave? The enemy in Iraq, in other words, is dynamic and changeable, a shadowy and loose group of forces made up of former officers and soldiers of the vast security and intelligence organs of the Ancien regime, foreign-born jihadis, or ideological commandos, who have slipped into Iraq from Saudi Arabia, Syria, and other Islamic countries, determined to confront and defeat the United States. And perhaps increasingly, young, unemployed Iraqis, angry at the American occupation and the difficulties it has brought, eager to avenge a relative's death or a personal affront, or simply desperate to earn some easy money by hiring themselves out to attack Americans. When you look at the goals of al-Qaeda when they attacked the United States on 9/11, what was the goal exactly? First of all, to create this enormous image of a kind of recruiting poster for jihadism, the image of the towers falling, the image of the towers attack. But secondly, it was to draw the United States out of its hole, as one of the al-Qaeda theorists put it. It was to, in their ambition, to drag the United States into a quagmire in Afghanistan. And like the Soviets before them, we are going to defeat the United States on the battlefield in Afghanistan. That was their thought. Well, of course, the US did not occupy Afghanistan right away in the way they expected. They did something much more beneficial to the jihadist cause. They occupied Iraq and they provided day after day, month after month, telegenic images of American troops abusing Muslims. This was exactly what al-Qaeda wanted to create. I mean, if you look at the images from Abu Ghraib, they might as well be recruitment posters made on Madison Avenue for the jihadi cause. The first result of that was the insurgency itself. The second result of it is ISIS. Because ISIS, of course, is the child, the descendant of al-Qaeda in Iraq, or al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, or al-Qaeda of the Two Rivers, whatever name you'd like to use. It is a result of Sunni hatred, dissatisfaction, and vulnerability at the new order in Iraq. That Iraqis loyal to a security-obsessed totalitarian regime of 3 decades would seek to fight the Americans who have overthrown it is not surprising. Nor should it be surprising that jihadis from outside and inside Iraq should seize the opportunity to attack infidels occupying an Islamic country. What is surprising is the degree to which the Americans, through their own lack of attention to the critical political tasks of the war's aftermath, have in effect assisted their efforts. What was the basic political task of the occupation of Iraq? It was to somehow switch power from the Sunni minority to the Shia majority, and to do it in a way that the Sunnis would accept it nonviolently. In fact, if you look at the early days of the occupation, everything the Americans did seems to have been pointed toward the opposite goal. The Americans acted again and again by dissolving the army, by de-Ba'athifying the country, by doing a number of very stupid policies. They acted again and again to enrage the Sunnis, to make them more vulnerable, to make them think they had to fight. Because a key part of the insurgency, even though we think now of ISIL as the Islamic State, that is, as mainly jihadist, in fact, it has a key cadre, a key level of functioning that comes from the Iraqi army, all of whom came from this relatively successful, very large army that we dissolved with very little thought beforehand and sent 400,000 young men onto the streets without any salaries and with simply their guns. So we humiliated these people. We laid the seeds down for the insurgency without a doubt. In effect, the United States created ISIS. Nothing like it existed before the American occupation. It was an insurgency that battened on the hatred of the Americans and the vulnerability and hatred of the Sunnis for the Shia. There's no way to understand it happening without the Americans there, because it built itself like a kind of bacterial host on the American occupation. We created it, it's ours, and now we're trying to deal with the consequences. Not for the first time, the United States has shown itself to be a strange hybrid creature, military giant and political dwarf. But Iraq is not Lebanon, from which the US could sail away and invade Grenada. The stakes are much higher. In the words of Hassan Salameh, the former Lebanese government minister and scholar who was working for the UN headquarters in Baghdad when it was bombed, you can't just get up and walk away from Iraq like you did Lebanon. No matter how bad it gets, if Iraq turns into anarchy, it's likely to spill into the rest of the Gulf. It would be a catastrophe. I think it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Watch out what you wish for, you will create it. And that is exactly what the United States ended up doing. Once the US began striking ISIS from the air in August 2014, there was an enormous surge in Islamic State recruitment. Haaretz reported that in the 6 weeks after those airstrikes began, ISIS had recruited 6,000 jihadis, a huge number, in a group that's supposed to number 20 to 30,000. 1,500 of those were foreign fighters. So I think this central perception from the beginning that the Iraq War was a dumb idea, not simply because it was going to be a lot harder and a lot more complicated than it was advertised as being, but it was a dumb idea because ideologically, it was the stupidest thing that the United States could do. But now we're in the new war, and this is the war that we're going to lose. Indeed, it may be that the United States, with its overwhelming military power, has succeeded only in transforming an eventual and speculative threat into a concrete and immediate one. Now the Bush administration finds itself trying to perform the tightrope walk of building a stable and friendly government beneath the shadow of escalating violence and a growing and inevitable nationalism. The administration began its Iraq venture with an air of absolute determination, taking a kind of grim pride in defying the United Nations and doing what is right. America and Iraq will need a different kind of determination now and a newfound honesty to go with it. Don't start a major policy until you know how you're going to finish it. Because when I look at this war against the Islamic State, I don't think our leaders know how it's going to finish. And it's going to be carried to the next administration, and who knows how far it will go. And at the moment, our actions are helping this group recruit dramatically. If we look at the Islamic State in Iraq, I think there is a fair amount of evidence that it would have collapsed in certain parts of Iraq of its own internal contradictions. I think that the United States, if it has learned anything, it should have learned to stop acting against its own best interests. And I think that the U.S. has not learned that.